All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. I'm Scott Horton. This is my show, The Scott Horton Show. Next up is Dan McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute. Welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Thanks, Scott. Great to talk to you again.
Good to have you here. Man, you've been writing a lot of good stuff lately. Some of it's at RT. That's the Ukraine piece. We're going to get to that in a minute. But first of all, you had a guest article by a guy whose name was hard to memorize, but it was a brilliant rundown of who's who and who's doing what in the jihadist war in Syria against Shiite and Christian civilians in the Jabhat al-Nusra and et cetera like that. And then you've got one here that I hope everyone will go read. Again, ronpaulinstitute.org. Is the U.S. waking up to the insanity of its Syria policy? And I can say I only hope, but I wonder what you could possibly be referring to that would give you hope that such a thing could be true.
Yeah, well, my hope was it lasted about 5 minutes while I, finished writing this piece, and then it started to damper again because we heard some whispers that the U.S. might be starting talks with this Islamic Front, which is created and financed by our wonderful friends the Saudis, who always seem to be financing extremism everywhere, basically as a fig leaf over the Al-Qaeda who's running things in Syria, So that's already tarnished, so they created this Islamic Front, which is like a supergroup. You remember Asia in the 80s? It's like a supergroup that's going to make us not think about Al-Qaeda too much. The problem is the Islamic Front and Al-Qaeda have been cooperating for quite some time in Syria, so it's a move by the U.S. They realize the reality on the ground is that their so-called moderates do not exist. What little there was in the first place has disintegrated, and they're left with a couple of Ahmad Chalabi types. So they're trying to figure out what to do, and so they're apparently getting ready to hold talks with this group, which would really do nothing but prolong the war, prolong the agony, prolong the killing. So. We can be slightly optimistic, and what the piece was about was that the former CIA director, Michael Hayden, said, of all the bad scenarios in Syria, probably the least bad would be, at this point, if Assad stays in power, because the alternatives look even worse. So, the U.S. has put itself in a tight spot with its interventionism. Now it doesn't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I guess the previous policy was, at first they thought he was going to go, but then they must have realized back in, by late 2011, well, we're talking about the Democrats, so at least by halfway through 2012 or at some point they had to have accepted that, okay, Assad is not falling, it's not as easy as we thought it was going to be, and so then plan B was, just make them, fight each other, scorpions in a bottle kind of a thing, and weaken everybody all around. But now I guess they're worried that the jihadists are going to win, or only half the government is. Retired Bush officials are concerned, but the Democrats want to persist. Is that it?
Yeah, well, I think they're hoping that the different jihadist groups might fight it out, and that some of the I don't know if they're hoping this, but that some of the what moderates there are, some of them have gone back to the government because they realize that the people they have been fighting with are much worse than Assad in terms of brutality and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd read that.
But, the U.S., unfortunately, it falls victim to its own myths and its own stories. It believes the lies and the propaganda that it tells us. And so it came to believe that there was this massive uprising in Syria of people who wanted democracy and all these wonderful things, and that would be enough to change the regime. But the fact of the matter is, if the entire country was as unhappy as they were saying, there's no way the president could have lasted this long. So, it was largely fomented from without. It was fomented by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the Gulf states, who are fighting sort of a proxy war with Iran in Syria. So it was much more complex, but they wanted to portray it as as a little guy standing up against the dictator. And that's not to say that we want to go over there and give Assad a hug. That's irrelevant to us because at least, you and I, what we care about is interventionism and the U.S. role in it. We don't care who rules anywhere as long as they don't bother us, right?
Well, sure. I mean, I care, but that doesn't mean I'm trying to give a permission slip to my government to do anything about or do something horrible in the name of what I care about.
Because they always mess it up. They mess up everything they touch here, and they mess up everything they touch overseas.
Yeah.
Go get it right.
But no, I mean, I agree with you that in this day and age, opinion means something you want the national government to do to somebody. So people just make that leap immediately, and I certainly am not in favor of that. But, all things being equal, nobody's got the right to inherit a dictatorship from anybody who never had the right to one in the first place ever. So, that's pretty much that.
But we don't like to tell our neighbors how they should live, and I mean, it's we may like our system the way we have it, but other people do have different views of the way they want to live. The Iranians seem to want to live in a country with that religious rule tends to be very strong, much stronger than here. It wouldn't be my cup of tea, to be honest, but who am I to say? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, and there are certainly societies where the hugest of supermajorities would agree that they want religious law, and that would be up to them and not me. Anyway. But so in this case, to get back to the specifics here, I was wondering if you could help break down, because I don't even know what difference there ever really was between the Al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State of Iraq, except maybe the Islamic State guys were more Iraqis and the Nusra guys were more local Syrians, but they've been working together this whole time. And so I'm just hoping you can help me understand which factions the Syrians, basically, they're trying to separate the Syrians away and back the Syrians and separate them away from the Iraqis more? Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, I don't know. I often think of the life of Brian when I try to pick these groups out. It's like the People's Front of Judea.
Yeah,
and the
exactly.
Judean People's Front, So.
Which group of suicide bombers is a lie is who?
Yeah, but, I mean, I tend to focus more on U.S. policy. Obviously, we have to understand as much as we can about what's going on the ground, but at the same time, we can't understand everything because we're not there. And unlike people like John McCain and the others who pretend they know everything about everything everywhere, we have a pretty good handle on what our policy should be, and I think that's the most important part, Yeah. And so that's what I tend to focus on more.
Well, yeah, I mean, although it's a very important argument to make, though, when, for example, John McCain is saying, oh, well, everything's just hunky-dory with the Northern Storm Brigade and the Free Syrian Army when, as you're reporting here, yeah, there is no Free Syrian Army, and even the Northern Storm Brigade were a bunch of veterans of the Iraq War where they'd practiced on killing our guys over there in the last war, Mr. McCain, kind of thing. So the facts on the ground count there, especially, when now we're talking about this new Islamic Front, which even if they're trying to say it's somehow separate from the worst of the sworn Al-Qaeda, it's no different whatsoever. You know what I mean? I mean, and in fact, I think, Dan, that because of you and others, I think this view is making progress. And like you're saying, even people like Hayden are sort of coming to their senses. And I think that some of the propaganda about this is falling flat on TV news and stuff, too, where, as even Hillary Clinton said, I mean, who are we supposed to be backing there? It's kind of hard to pick out the good guys.
What I think is kind of funny, Scott, is that this Islamic Front broke into some warehouses and stole a bunch of military equipment that the U.S. had meant for the so-called moderates, and the U.S. sent them a memo saying, "Could you guys please return this? You're not supposed to get it." We kind of promised the Americans who paid for this that it wouldn't fall into the hands of extremists, And so
I heard that. I thought it was a prank. Did they really? Yeah, and then they did. They confirmed it. Yes, we did send them a pretty please note, which they rejected.
Probably a tweet or something.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, I was going to say one more thing. There was Patrick Coburn. You referred to the fact that, we're not there. Well, Patrick Coburn's been there a lot of times, and he had this long-form piece in The Independent the other day, Britain's policy on Syria is falling apart. where it's, virtually he's saying the exact same thing as you hear about the hopelessness of what they've gotten us into, the rock and the hard place and all of that, and how nobody knows what's going to come next. But it seems to me like it would be a surprise if there really was a Syria anymore after this, or if it had anything like its old shape anyway.
I mean, it's not to say that just by virtue of traveling and getting around, you're automatically right. But I find that people who do go to these places, they do have a better sense, and I know you know Eric Margulies, who I have enormous respect for, and he's always traveling. He sees the world, and he so I respect his opinions more, because it's very difficult to understand these places and the culture. Things are driven by culture and history, and so it's just difficult to get a real handle on it when you're not there.
Right. Yeah, and both of those guys have been saying for a long time that something huge would have to change in terms of foreign intervention to make Assad lose now. I mean, he's been, winning in the rebellion, so-called rebellion on the run for, a year and a half in a row now.
Yeah.
The momentum hasn't been the other way this whole time.
Yeah. What I think is funny, and I kind of mentioned it in the piece I wrote, is that this sort of leftish humanitarian interventionists, they love to champion the rights of the minorities, and I think particularly in the U.S. and there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but the people they've been supporting in Syria, they have a long track record of just wiping out minorities, the Christians, the Alawites, all of these minority groups. They're talk about extreme prejudice, and it just shows the situational ethics of a lot of interventionists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and by the way, that article I was referring to earlier, it's Dmitry Minin at ronpaulinstitute.org, Sinister Fruits of the West's Alliance with Jihad Warriors in Syria. And that's some good writing there, some serious
journalism. It's a heavy piece, he's very good.
Yeah. And it's all bad news, too, I'm afraid to say. These guys are bad news. And this is just, imagine that it's the 1980s Afghan war or even the Iraq war, only now this much closer to the West, one more country, giving them direct access to the Mediterranean Sea, and, who knows from there.
And when you think about all these foreign fighters, I'm not super hyped up on the war on terror, because a lot of it's phony, but I am concerned about some of these Western fighters who go over there, and they become not only radicalized, but they do learn a lot of techniques that can be quite dangerous. And what's going to happen when they come home? They come back to the UK, they come back to the US, and there are quite a few of them. We should be pretty worried about that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something Patrick Coburn was saying on the show, too, was that, right now these guys are really focused on killing Shia, but if they're stopped from being able to continue doing that, they might just turn west. When this thing is over, we're going to have a lot of leftover guys. The next stage of blowback from our interventionism is teeing up now.
Yeah, and
it's
all
that easy to see.
Sure, and all financed by our great friends the Saudis.
And all because we invaded Iraq in the last decade.
Yeah. No, that's the nature of interventionism. It creates new problems that the interventionists want to do more interventions to solve. It's a never-ending cycle.
Well, and speaking of which, let's talk about NATO expansion. You've been really good on these color-coded revolutions, especially concerning these countries in Eastern Europe bordering Russia. And I don't know how anybody could consider Georgia part of the North Atlantic to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but obviously, NATO expansion is a big part of this. But in specific, there was a fight, a political fight in Ukraine over a trade deal with the EU or a trade deal with the Russians, and at the last minute, the head politician changed his mind and all hell broke loose. Why don't you get more specific, please?
What's interesting is, the EU's policy all along has been to view this as a sort of a geopolitical, geostrategic move to, sort of bring Ukraine into the fold, i.e. make it part of the EU. And not to say the Russians are saints, but their approach has been to Ukraine that, you can talk to both us and them. We don't have to make a mutually exclusive deal. But the EU, but Brussels is pulling you into one, and you should think twice about taking it because we buy a lot of your stuff, and they're not going to buy any of your stuff. So certainly it's reasonable to consider the reasons that Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president, at the last minute had some second thoughts. He hasn't shut the door, although the protesters portrayed it as him slamming the door shut. He said, this particular deal I'm a little bit concerned about. I don't really see that it's to our advantage, so I want to hold off and, I don't know, get a better deal or something. But that's when, you're right, I mean, all heck broke loose. People jumped into the streets, and they've been there for a couple of weeks. And, their intent is to overthrow the government. They've used violence. They've occupied government buildings. And, I'm not super keen on police violence, but guess what? What would happen if you and I started to occupy the White House? It wouldn't turn out well for us, Scott.
Well, I don't know about all the internal politics there, and well, let me ask you this. When you say that they've used violence, what have they done that's violent, other than just resist the cops in the street, or what?
Well, one of the things that probably wouldn't go over that well here is they took a tractor and they drove it into the police lines, so, and they've used, there's videos of them using long chains to beat the police with, sort of 5 or 6 feet lengths of chains against the cops. And, so the idea that they're completely peaceful protesters is not the case. But regardless, obviously people, we believe people should have the right to protest. We have some pretty severe restrictions here in Washington, D.C. as to how you can hold a protest, what you can do, where you can do it. So it's kind of silly for us to expect everywhere else would not have anything similar to what we've had. Yeah, what we see in Kiev is certainly a lot more leeway being given to these protesters than you'd get here in Washington, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'd hate to see modern America be the standard for such things, but I do understand your point.
Well, look down in Venice, the cops are beating up a bunch of...
This is what happens in a democracy. 51% gets their way, or at least, after a public choice theory vote is held, then the people who end up on top of that get to decide. And then if, 49% or 51% are mad, then they can either go along with the decision that they disagree with, or they can try to hold a general strike or what. They don't necessarily have to go along, but that's part of having that kind of a divided society. It is really divided, isn't it? East and West, and Orthodox versus Catholic, and more Russia-leaning culturally versus more European-leaning. So it's sort of Republicans, Democrats, only I would say with seemingly more substantial differences between the major factions there.
Sure, yeah. But, what really gets me is the hypocrisy on the part of the U.S. and the European Union, particularly the U.S. There have been some violence, there's some violent police reactions, some people have been hurt. But the U.S. is, literally sending U.S. officials to the protesters to express U.S. support for an overthrow of the government. But look at Venice today. The cops are beating up a bunch of Italians who are protesting against austerity measures that the IMF demands. Look what happened in Romania when they're protesting against the fracking and other things. The cops are beating the heck out of them. Mm-hmm. Look what happened in Egypt. 1,000 people got wiped out who were simply trying to go out and protest in favor of a government that actually had been elected. And the U.S. says nothing about any of these,
Yeah, it didn't bat an eye over that.
Yeah, the hypocrisy is just so repulsive. And then you get these horrible people like John McCain, going into the middle of Kiev thinking that he's, some sort of Soviet commissar who gets to tell the Ukrainians what kind of government they have. And who does he run off to? He runs off to meet with this the leader of this extremist anti-Semitic party, who, I was reading up on them, and they wear T-shirts, saying something like "beat up Jews" and things like this, So here once again, just like when he went to Syria and met with a bunch of jihadis, he goes to Ukraine and meets with a bunch of skinheads and druggies, and it just shows how absurd the whole thing is.
Yeah, well, John McCain, and And, well, let me ask you this. Is there actually the people out there protesting in the street, is there an argument that you could credit to them other than, well, we just don't like the decision that was made here? Or are they saying that they were defrauded somehow or anything? What's their message that's so catchy that they got this many people out backing it? Because it's not just a rent-a-mob, right? They've recruited some young Democrats.
Yeah, the U.S. has been financing the NGO sector in Ukraine for a long time, for a decade. And they continue to finance. They continue. If you look at USAID and everyone, they still spend millions of dollars a year propping up these NGOs. And so, well, perhaps they're not rent-a-mob. I often wonder who is paying the protesters to go ahead and sit in the middle of the square for 2 weeks. I mean, I don't know about you, Scott, but if I were to simply walk off my job for 2 weeks, I'd have a heck of a time paying the bills and eating. It makes you wonder where they are getting paid from and who is paying for them to sit out there endlessly.
And it sure does seem strange that this is the issue that's got them all rioting, right? Like in Brazil, it started as a protest over increased bus fares, price inflation, where it really hurts the poorest, the hardest, right? Pretty easy explanation of what's going on there. But and you can see how something like that could be hijacked too, of course. But in this case, they were upset about a marginal trade deal that wasn't actually going to trade their previous trade deal with the EU that they already had very much. Anyway, what? How's this a spark for anything?
It's pretty fun. It is pretty suspicious. And, Yanukovych is not, he's no sort of iron-fisted guy either. If anything, he's been kind of wimpy. Immediately after this thing, after the first week or so, he said, "Oh no, don't worry, guys. We're gonna go talk to the EU." He dispatched a team to Brussels. He wants to renegotiate. So it's not like he's sitting up there crossing his arms and sticking out his tongue. They probably wish he was a little bit more difficult to deal with. But if anything, he's proven pliant.
Yeah. And now, what about that? Am I right about that? This trade deal wasn't actually going to trade their current, change their current trade deal that much? I guess I heard NPR lady saying that, so I shouldn't take that to the bank. But she sort of seemed to be conceding it, that this is actually not that big of a change of policy one way or the other, really. Maybe just in a symbolic way because it's about whether to lean west or east.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. Starting the process. And it's starting to, and it's also starting to suck Ukraine deeper and deeper into the IMF web. Here, take out a bunch more loans, guys. That's what you need. That'll help.
Yeah, you can buy some Lockheed products with them.
That's a good point. And actually, we're about to put this up, but one of our board members, who I admire enormously, Dennis Kucinich, wrote a great piece on what's this going to mean. What they really want is NATO membership for Ukraine, so they can start selling them a bunch of garbage they don't need, and stirring up arguments and fights that they don't need to have. So, right. That's certainly something to consider.
Yeah, well, and that's certainly been a Lockheed project all along, right? Bruce Jackson from Lockheed created a committee on NATO expansion, where it was just the committee on coming up with excuses for NATO expansion. That's all it was back in the 1990s.
Absolutely.
Get all these guys on the F-16 dole.
Yeah, and what's it done for any of these countries? It's given jobs to people like Radek Sikorsky, who not that long ago was haunting the halls of AEI in Washington as just another neocon. And now he's, foreign minister of Poland. He's down there marching in Kiev. He's screaming at the Ukrainians that they better do this and that and the other. He sounds just like an old Soviet apparatchik, It's incredible how intolerable these EU bureaucrats are.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember Pat Buchanan once asked hypothetically, and I'm afraid of this hypothetical, honestly, but he said, what if angry right-winger came to power in Russia and decided they want to take some old territories back? Are we really going to give up all our major cities to fight? That's what NATO membership ostensibly means, is that an attack on Kiev is an attack on D.C., but really, I thought an attack on Kiev is a tragedy, but not an attack on D.C.
Exactly. No, you're right. And that's the ridiculousness of it. And I think if it came down to it, we probably wouldn't do it because it is insane and stupid. Although we seem to be getting closer in China, it has nothing to do with NATO, but we're certainly, there are plenty of provocations between Japan and China, and we seem to be wading into those waters too. So who knows? I mean, interventionism is a virus. It's a disease. These people need to take a 12-step program or something.
Right. Yeah. Did you see they had naval warships, American and Chinese warships, had a close call. These klutzes out there with all their high-tech gear and their zillion-dollar radar systems. Whoa, hard maneuvers to the port side, Captain, and all this and that. And they almost crashed. And I don't know if that would have led directly to a war or something like that. But actually, something like that could well be misinterpreted, on one side or the other. Or
for
political reasons, twisted,
We'd rather have close encounters between U.S. and Chinese businessmen. That's something that produces something that we all want and like. Products and commerce and jobs. I mean,
yeah, and let them provide their own security out there on the high seas. They're making money.
That's a good point. You're right.
Kick American shipping off of the security dole. We don't need a U.S. Navy anymore. Not on the Chinese coast or the American one either. All right. Well, maybe that's just me. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. Take care.
Appreciate it. That's Dan McAdams, everybody. He's running the Ron Paul Institute over there at, I'm clicking on my Ron Paul section. You know what it is, ronpaulinstitute.org.